For those who spend long periods of time at sea for work, what is the eeriest or creepiest thing you have ever encountered out on the water? On deployment in the Arabian Gulf, simply seeing the number of oil rigs out there. It is a thing that, in the back of my mind, I knew happened, offshore drilling that is, but seeing the staggering, awe-inspiring number of them shook me to my core. What's more, as I sailed through the Gulf, there were times we had to turn off our water production machines because the seawater was so filthy with oil, sewage and other trash that it would have either clogged our system or made us sick. It was a harrowing vision of what might become of our oceans. While out somewhere in the western Pacific Ocean, it was a dark, dull night like any other. Partly cloudy in a new moon, so it was pitch black, could hardly see a thing. Then we saw a meteor burn up in the lower part of the atmosphere. The flare-up was as bright as the sun. For a whole second, it was as if it was daylight, and it burned up in brilliant colors of green, red, and orange. And then it was all over as quickly as it began. The one I heard from a friend a long time ago. It happened in the 1970s, I believe. Not on the sea, but on a river in a secluded area. They were kayaking, a group of people, in the evening. Suddenly, the river around them started to glow. Many lights underwater. It was a mystery for them for many years. Until one day, years later, my friend heard the story from another perspective on the radio. A group of filmmakers were tasked to film underwater life. Maybe it was nocturnal underwater life, I can't remember now. And they said where it was filmed, and they had to test the lighting they installed. The group of kayaking friends just happened to be in the right place at the right moment. As it was evening, they didn't see anyone. And after many years, the mystery was finally solved. Not me, but my brother is an avid sailor. He has done numerous open ocean crossings and sailed to the Galapagos, etc. He was on night watch one night and had a large container ship make contact with him, just verifying each other's course and speed to avoid collision. The container ship also checked in on them to ensure they were okay and didn't need any assistance. They then asked my brother if they were sailing with another boat, as the ship's radar showed two boats similar in size, one being the boat my brother was on and another about 2 miles behind him, matching course and speed. Neither my brother or the container ship could make visual contact with the other vessel. The container ship even said it's not likely a radar shadow as they tend to be very close to each other. My brother said it helped him stay awake that night. I wasn't at work but sailing off the coast of Grand Banks, maybe 50 or 75 miles offshore, and clear as day, maybe 10 yards to our right in the trough of a wave, there was a black round object covered with knobs that was only visible when the trough of the wave passed over it. 5 of us saw it in the middle of daylight. I was skeptical that I had actually seen a mine. Years later, I mentioned this story to a naval historian at the San Diego Maritime Museum, and he confirmed that it was entirely possible there's still World War II ordnance in that general area. Maybe someone on Reddit can verify or show me I'm wrong. The historian told me I should try to relay its general area to the Coast Guard. I have had friends who were stationed in Guam who all had stories. One of them was a friend who lived up high in some apartments that overlooked a harbor that was famous for deep-sea fishing tours. One day, he saw a small boat that had a big catch, probably a 10 to 15 foot great white shark, that didn't fit on the boat, so they were trailing it. While he was watching from his balcony, he saw a school of fish behind the carcass, which wasn't that unusual. But this school of fish moved differently. He said it looked more like some kind of large tadpole. It kept darting toward the carcass and then swimming away, which is also school behavior. He thought the angle must be funny, but then the tadpole swam up to the shark, and suddenly the shark disappeared under the water. The boat that was trailing it stalled like it dropped anchor from the aft and struggled before suddenly bobbing forward. Only the shark's head was left. They pulled it up, circled the area, and then left. Whatever got away with 80% of the carcass must have had a mouth at least 10 feet wide. He had heard of this but never seen it himself. Nobody was surprised when he retold the story. Another friend had a more light-hearted story. Diving in Guam, there's a lot of bomb craters in the shallows. Barracuda hunt as a pack when young, but as adults, they are solitary and territorial. One popular diving site had Bob the Barracuda, who guarded those craters. Now, barracuda aren't dumb, they know you're spearfishing, which means easy food. They are apparently actually inquisitive and fairly intelligent, like morays, but looked like 6-foot silver torpedoes with terrifying teeth. People would bribe Bob with hot dogs. The local bait shops had 8 packs of francs, and you'd bring one with you because Bob, and other sea life, sure loved hot dogs. Bob also was very stealthy. You wouldn't see him until he was right at your face mask. He expected hot dogs. My friend said one day, he was out looking for fish, and Bob appeared out of nowhere, as he was wont to do, but highly focused on his groin. I had forgotten that I had my hot dogs in a net bag between my legs. Let me tell you, I really moved slowly and carefully to get Bob his hot dogs because I wanted no misunderstanding. Once saw a weird thing sticking out of the water off West Africa, couldn't figure out what it was. We diverted to get closer, then saw it was a whale tail, just sticking out of the water, not moving. Got closer still, and confirmed it was a whale's tail, and then realized the poor bugger must be dead. Was sad. Then as we got close enough to pass, it suddenly slipped under the waves. A minute later, the clearly alive whale sprayed a whole bunch of water in our direction. I think that was whale 4. I was trying to take a nap, you bastards, until you woke me up. About halfway between Hawaii and California, we, the bridge team on a US Navy ship, saw a stationary, perfectly straight line almost 20 miles long on surface search radar. At first, we thought it was a radar systems issue. As we approached, we didn't see anything unusual. Clear day. No other vessels in sight. Only when we approached to within a few hundred yards could we see choppy water with 1 to 2 foot chaotic waves in a perfectly straight line about 20 yards across with a distinct border separating it from otherwise calm, almost glassy, sea. The line extended in both directions as far as we could see. The straightness was what was most eerie to us. We measured the ocean surface temperature outside the zone and in it and noted a 2° Fahrenheit difference. The choppy water was colder. We passed through the zone without incident. Was a submariner. We got some new escape suits aboard and were running familiarization exercises while underway. The exercise involved opening the lower of the 2 escape hatches in the engine room and going into the escape trunk. It was wild to just look at the single upper hatch, knowing what was on the other side waiting to kill us all if we messed up. If that wasn't enough, I was sleeping in my rack some time after and had a dream about being in the escape trunk when someone closed and locked me into the trunk, and the upper hatch was about to open. I started punching the lower hatch yelling, "Let me out." When I woke up, the dude in the rack above me asked if I was okay because I was punching the bejesus out of the ceiling of my rack, lol. Other than that, doing any amount of time at test depth. Sometimes the only way to tell if a repair was successful was to go deep. Was out at sea on an AR, auxiliary oil replenishment, basically a merchant ship that supplies fuel and supplies to Navy ships. We were out in December in the North Atlantic. We were plowing into swells large enough that the spray from the bow was hitting the windows of the bridge. The bridge is 6 decks up and 400 feet aft of the bow. Anyhow, we're pounding through it. You can hear the whole 27,000-ton ship groaning and shuddering every time we hit a swell. Then the watertight door alarm goes off for the door that leads from the cargo section out onto the deck. Taking water into the dry cargo well through that hatch would have been very, very bad. In the end, thankfully, the alarm was caused because the ocean removed the sensor, not that there was a problem with the door. Standing on the bridge, watching the Mediterranean in 1996, probably 50 miles north of Tunisia, at 2 a.m., something came down from the sky in a streak and exploded, and it was absolute daylight for a few seconds. Bright enough that we were seriously concerned that a nuclear explosion had happened. Probably just a big meteorite or something exploding, but it was something to see. Same year, we were doing very slow survey lines in the Mediterranean, 1.5 knots with absolutely nothing around us or on the radar, and a flare went off directly in front of us. Found out later that it was a submarine that had kindly included us in war games and was letting us know that we were dead. My father was a lobsterman. I spent a lot of time on the boat with him throughout my childhood and teens. When I was about 10, I recall fishing for bait, using lines with multiple lures thrown over the side and hauled back up. When the sea was clear and calm, you'd see the fish on the line as you brought it in, flashes of silver in the blue. Occasionally, there'd be a big dark shape, and one of your fish wouldn't be there after. This didn't worry me until the day this happened at the waterline, and I watched a 10-foot blue shark turn side on and stare me right in the eye as it stole a mackerel off the hook. The image has never left me. I watched Jaws at too early an age, I think. We were cruising in the Bahamas one night in the Devil's Triangle. All of a sudden, we heard this chain dragging down the hull for like a minute. Just scraping. It was unnerving. And it was in Exuma Sound, which is like thousands of feet deep, which means it would have been floating and hanging off the bottom of something like an old mine drifting for years. We came about to try and find it, but we could never find it again. It just disappeared. Another time, we were under the polar ice cap, and the ice sheet moans all the time. Like what you think a mermaid siren would sound like. And sometimes you can hear it through the hull. For about 65 days straight. Non-stop. The North Pole is absolutely the quietest place you can ever be, and in November, it has this fog that's always there. You can't tell how far anything is away. It gets very unnerving after a while. One of my first few trips out on a West Coast trawler, I was in the wheelhouse, and the weather wasn't bad, but birds kept showing up and trying to sneak into the inner parts of the boat. Apparently, they try to get inside to shelter from storms. Later that night, I was almost hurled from my bunk and was told someone broke their neck once from the same thing. Also, an overworked engineer was using a shop vac to handle water flooding. Being at sea reminds me of how many of our industries used to be crazy dangerous, and that many of them still are, but you don't realize it when you aren't in it. I was regularly a solid 22 hours from emergency services. If something bad happens, it's up to the others present if you survive. And I was constantly thinking about how if you fall into the ocean without a survival suit, it takes about 8 minutes for hypothermia to mess you up. Which is also shorter than many boats can turn around to try and get you. I was on a night dive. It was a dive site I was familiar with, and as is common practice, the captain had fixed a steady strobe light to the anchor line of the boat so we could find our way back. As I was readying to complete my dive and ascend, I wondered why the strobe was no longer blinking and now just a steady beam. Looking at my compass, I was doubly confused by how I had gotten my navigation so wrong. I felt foolish. Had I been cocky and overexcited because I was comfortable with this site? How could I have miscalculated my direction so? It's a dangerous mistake at any time for a diver, much more so at night. But as I was ascending, the brightness of the light really irked me. Why would the captain change the strobe on us? Was something wrong? Then it hit me. I wasn't swimming toward the boat at all. I was swimming toward the moon. The water was so clear and calm, I had mistaken it for a light. Luckily, I hadn't ascended fully and wasn't too far off. I was able to redirect to my original navigation, eventually finding the strobe, the boat, and a renewed respect for the ocean's ability to make you second-guess yourself. Neither terribly eerie nor, technically, at sea, but I was involved as crew sailing from Chicago to Mackinac Island on Lake Michigan. This is big enough that you can't see land if you're in the middle. It's a freshwater sea in some sense. The boat was, shall we say, not well maintained, so our lights were out and the GPS had packed it in, though there was a handheld if we needed it. The compass was also way off, so I had the guy with the GPS read our track off until I was set for where we needed to be. I looked up and spotted the North Star, Polaris, at a point in the rigging and just kept it there all night. I told the next watch to just sleep in since I was in the groove, and it was magic. We sailed a perfect course until dawn. My dad's story. He was an engineer on merchant ships. This happened one night during the 1960s. He was sailing with a Chinese crew. They liked to put the ship's arc lights on and go night fishing. One night, he heard them making a commotion on deck and went to look. Just at the edge of the light was a long, rippling thing, about 50 feet long. It moved for several minutes, then just disappeared. The crew was very excited by it. I now suspect it was an oarfish, but we will never know for certain. I was working on a pearl boat for around 18 months on the Arafura Sea a few years ago, and one of my roles was keeping watch in the wheelhouse. Essentially, you make sure the boat is following the preset path on the navigation, and if it strays, you turn it manually to keep it within the course set. My watch was from 4 to 8 a.m. About 7 a.m., I noticed a white cube perhaps 200 meters port side, hard to say with no point of reference, but it didn't show up on the navigation/radar system we had that let you plot/recognize boats. It was also not bobbing up and down with the waves, it was just sitting there on the waterline in the distance. I got a better look at it with the binoculars, and it was so strange seeing this white cube just sitting still there on the sea in the distance. It wasn't really hovering above it, but as the waves moved with the ocean, every now and again I could see the bottom of it, which is how I know it was a cube. Again, it's hard to say without a point of reference at sea, but I'm guessing it was the size of a van. I'm purely going off how big things appear in the binoculars when looking at things I do know the size of. The person who was following my shift came to drop me a coffee, and he saw it too, so I know it wasn't just me being tired. Following this, a few years later, I saw when the Tic Tac videos came out from the Pentagon, and some of the fighter pilots said they saw 5 shaped objects floating in the sky. Research vessel in the early 90s about 200 miles off of South Carolina. We could hold position within a few dozen meters using a satellite system, predates GPS, so we stayed parked for days at a time. Sargasso seaweed would drift past us on its way to Europe. One time the bridge called out an oil slick that turned out to be a pod of killer whales drifting past, about to pass half a mile, or so, off the port side. Before the slick came alongside, 2 whales came over and patrolled stem to stern, maybe 30 feet off the port rail, while the rest of the pod stayed with their kill. About when the kill was even with us, 2 more whales came and patrolled with the first 2, taking 2 complete laps altogether. Then the first 2 left to rejoin the lunch party, while the new squad stayed with us. After a while, those 2 left and we never saw any of them again. At no time did they go to the starboard side, and they never went far beyond the ends of our ship. It was an organized guard patrol, their message was very clear, and no one denied that we had been warned off. We never did figure out what was on the menu, but it was large enough to form a huge oil slick. Submariner here. I was a sonar technician, and we were out on a mission and had the towed arrays out. We were deep and picked up a couple of bios like shrimp and whales. It was quiet for about 20 minutes after we passed them. All of a sudden, we heard a screeching noise like metal on metal. We thought we ran into another sub. The whole boat went into battle stations and woke up our SME riders to determine what that was. This went on for about 5 minutes, just in and out. It sounded like a song when you started to replay it. The whole thing was recorded, but the acting couldn't determine what it was, nor could the sonar chief. A message was sent out when we went to periscope depth, and the recording was sent to our squadron and the Office of Naval Intelligence once we pulled in. I do not know what happened afterward, but apparently, the Navy collects these types of recordings regularly. From what we could tell, it was close and almost as big as the boat. We couldn't tell if it was bio or another boat, no screw noises or ingestion of water, and no, we didn't hit anything. A dead body floating in the water. The crew got it into a stretcher, double-bagged it, kept it in the freezer, and turned it over to the local authorities at the next port visit. I had a role in that. It was in an advanced state of decomposition, but there was enough remaining to get an identification by dental records. Some family got closure. We responded to a sailboat that was taking on water. It became clear that the sailboat wasn't going to make it. We brought the crew of the sailboat onto our vessel and then we sort of waited around and watched the sailboat sink. What struck me is how silent it was. No fuss. No drama. It wasn't like a dark and stormy night or anything. It was a picture-perfect day. Glassy ocean with not a cloud in the sky, and it didn't matter. It was the kind of day that most seafarers dream about, and yet these blokes had been in a fight for their lives trying to keep their boat afloat. After it sank, there were a few bubbles, and then that was it. You'd have never known there was ever a sailboat there. Just a beautiful day without a trace of struggle. I overheard a man calling the Coast Guard over the radio around 5 a.m. He had taken his son-in-law out for an early morning fishing trip, and the son-in-law had seemingly just jumped over the side of the boat. The man was panicking and saying he kept trying to pull him in, but he wouldn't let him. Poor guy, I can't imagine what he was going through for that to seem like the only option. The worst part is not knowing if they got him out or not. Not quite at sea. Long Island Sound. I was out fishing, and we were fishing along the bottom, which was about 40 feet down or so. This was years ago, so it could have been 100 feet. But I got snagged on something that I thought was a big fish, but it felt too solid, and I couldn't get it up. Whatever I hooked was moving at an incredibly steady pace away from us, pretty slowly too. No thrashing, no give, just like I hooked an underwater conveyor belt that wouldn't stop for anything. Eventually, we had to slash the line to keep the entire spool from being unreeled, but no one had any clue what it was. Either some crazy underwater floating debris, or possibly, because there's a submarine manufacturer near there, I got stuck on a submarine, lol. It was so weird, though, and I'd call the unknown factor eerie. I'm in the Navy and a part of the photography team that takes pictures of anything interesting. One night, there were heavy clouds, and it was so dark you couldn't see your hand an inch from your face until your eyes adjusted. We saw an orange glow on the horizon, and they called the photography team to investigate. It's not uncommon for offshore oil rigs to have a burning flame, so we investigated but couldn't quite make out what it was. We requested for the ship to head in that direction to get a better look. The ship changed course, and as we got closer, it just disappeared. No ships, no oil rig, nothing. Just pitch black. Mid-watch, on the flying bridge of a cutter in the Eastern Pacific, and I haven't even seen a bird for probably 15 days. It's been at least 2 weeks since I've seen anything other than the occasional turtle or fish splash. It's a dark, overcast night, and I see what I can only describe as a large bat or pterodactyl. The sense of dread I get from this thing swooping around my perch on top of the bridge is ridiculous. I'm hiding alongside the steel mast and trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. This flying thing, with what I estimate to be about a 15-foot wingspan, swoops around me for about 10 minutes while I'm petrified. During this whole encounter, I don't hear anything besides the flapping of wings. To this day, I assume I imagined the whole thing due to sleep deprivation, but it was definitely the most realistic waking nightmare I've ever had. In the Gulf of Mexico, commercial fishing. We had been out about 5 days and started heading back to port. The captain came running out of the wheelhouse one night, screaming. He turned off the deck lights, no moon, pitch black skies, calm seas, which was rare at night during the summer. The other men and I were like, what the heck? He said, look at the back of the boat. As we were moving through the water was glowing a beautiful bluish-green color, and we could see at least 80 feet down, giant snapper, a few reef sharks, and a lot of remora. It was incredible. The captain said the only reason he noticed was from the wake of our bow. Apparently, it only glows when the water is moving. It's beautiful, almost alien-like. He said he had never seen the seas so calm in his 30 years as a captain, and only once before had he seen the sea glow. Giant spears plunging in and out of the sea. In the Gulf of Alaska, I have seen some strange things. But one of the most terror-inspiring sights involves loose logs from the logging trade. Sometimes, when a big log gets loose from a raft, it becomes partially waterlogged and floats small end up. So you have this 4-foot diameter telephone pole in the sea, sticking up 40 feet into the air. No biggie. It shows up on radar and is easy to spot. Now, give that pole 20 years of floating around or so. It rots in such a way that it becomes filed to a point by wind and waves, and looks quite menacing. Now, put it in a gale with 25-foot waves, 50 feet trough to peak. And it becomes a towering spike of death that shoots up from the sea every 15 to 20 minutes, out of nowhere, 60 feet into the air, only to plunge down into the dark depths, waiting to skewer some unsuspecting boat in a few minutes when it thrusts out of the ocean again. It is a genuinely terrifying sight, rare, but not so rare that I haven't seen two in one season. It's like the spiked spear of Neptune looking for an opportunity to mess up your day in a particularly terrifying way. Not creepy but freaked out my dad. He was in the Navy during World War II. He was around 20 years old, so pretty young and inexperienced, maybe 8 months at sea. There was one guy on board everyone was afraid of, even the officers. He had a screw loose and a really scary demeanor. Really strong and mean. Because of this, he got away with a lot of stuff. At the last port, this guy smuggled on a dog. When they were out at sea, this dog got loose and jumped over the side with the boat going full speed. The mean guy jumped over after the dog. Everyone knew this guy couldn't swim. My dad, in a moment of poor judgment, jumped overboard to help him. When he turned to look, the boat a minute later was already a mile away and was in the process of slowing so it could turn. The water was freezing, and they were in it for 14 minutes, but they all survived. After that, this guy didn't say a word but looked out for my dad. Not a sailor, but I actually traveled for a bit with a singing gospel team, and we would go from church to church all across the American South. One day, we were in a really small church, and this old guy comes up to my friend and me and just says, "I was in the Navy a long time, worked in a submarine." And after listening a bit, he seemed comfortable to tell two young lads something secret. I was really trusted by the captain/commander, I can't remember what terms he used, and we had orders to be near Antarctica during the Cold War. We were very deep under some ice, and he let me look in the periscope, few people got to, and what I saw. I can't tell you what I saw beneath the ice, but it changes everything. Everything you know about this world is a lie, boy. And before I could ask, he just walked away. Maybe he was pulling my leg, but it was definitely some quality terror. U.S. Navy veteran here. This was on the USS Kitty Hawk, an aircraft carrier. I worked in a squadron, taking care of F/A-18 Super Hornets. One night, we were somewhere north of Australia, and the flight deck was quiet except for people doing routine maintenance. Because they don't want to get spotted by enemy ships, they keep the flight deck really dark. There's a dull tungsten light, but you still have to watch your step. A guy in my shop was on top of a jet, greasing the metal slats of the exhaust, which was right on the edge of the flight deck. He runs back down to the shop to get more grease, and while he's down there, the flight deck boss has the jet moved back even further, so the tires are right on the edge and the tail end of the jet is hanging off over the water. He goes back to finish the grease job, not knowing that the part of the jet he is on is out over the water, slips, and falls over 90 feet into the ocean. We all thought he was gone. They lose guys in the daytime. It was even more difficult at night. 20 minutes later, though, they bring him back. He showed up for work the next day, and his face is all messed up. Apparently, he had fallen all that way and landed on his face. I'm still shocked the rescue team found him. I was on a DDG somewhere in the Pacific when I got a call from a division mate asking me to look for someone topside. I've done this many times before, but this was my first time going topside during a small storm, with the ship darkened, and at night. So I went out the normal hatch, and when I made it past the cover doors, I couldn't see anything. Literally just black. That's when I started to get worried for the guy I was looking for, so I proceeded to go up a ladder towards the area he was supposed to be, screaming his name into the night while the wind drowned out everything but itself, the rain, and the waves. After about 10 minutes of blind stumbling and wall hugging, basically pathed my way by memory, I decided he wasn't there and went back inside, soaking wet and kinda shook. When I went down to tell the guy that I couldn't find him, all the guys in the corner I was in just looked at me with gaping mouths and snapped their necks towards the one who asked me to do this and shouted, "Why the fuck didn't you tell him to put on a life jacket and a chem light?" Then one of the guys walked up to me and whispered, "Real talk, I've always wanted to do that, so how was it?" I responded with, "Definitely one of the scariest moments in my life, because one good slip and I either fall and mess myself up or go overboard and no one would have known." They told me to never speak of what I just did again, and when I left, I saw the guy I was looking for wearing a life jacket and a chem light around his neck. He said, "Did you go outside? I can't believe he didn't tell you," then proceeded to go into the space I was just in, most likely to yell at the guy. I felt super bad too because he forgot how new I was to being at sea and he was just worried. I was ship's company on an aircraft carrier, and we went into a nasty storm. The procedure is to tie down everything for rough seas. Being in the air department, I helped tie down the aircraft. We chained the aircraft down securely, and these chains were pretty decent chains. We lost a helicopter in that storm, there wasn't room for it in the hangar bays, so it was tied down on deck. They shared the recording of it going from the CCTV of the flight deck the next day with everyone. We hit a massive wave head-on, like I've seen skyscrapers smaller than this wave. When the water cleared, the helicopter was gone. I still think about that storm. An aircraft carrier is the size of a small town, and this wave dwarfed it completely. I couldn't imagine being on anything smaller, we probably would have just sunk. Non-sailor here, but if it helps, I remember a post from years ago that sticks in my mind even now. It seems a guy was sailing in a small boat on the ocean one day in very high seas. He was handling it well, but he was surrounded by high seas, way higher than his mast. Apparently, as he struggled with some task or other on the deck, something caught his eye in one of the waves, a long shadow of some kind that blotted out the sunlight that was partially filtering through the wall. It was a whale. He was looking up through the wave at a whale that was suspended in the wave far above his head. That stuck with me. Imagine how stunning and eerie that would feel. That and the sailor who said they were in high seas where, thanks to the high peaks and low troughs, they could look down at seagulls flying lower than the boat was riding. I used to be on the crew of a tall ship, and granted this wasn't at sea, but one night on a long sail south, we anchored at a tiny little island off the coast. There were a few farms on the island, a bar, a little shop, real tiny. The crew went to the bar for the night, but I was too young to go in, so I decided to have my own adventure on the island with another underage topman. It was the middle of the night, but the moon was really bright. We hiked to the other side of the island, probably less than a mile, and on that dark beach, we came across dozens of sea lion carcasses. They were all over the beach and the hills in varied states of decay. It was lucky we happened to be there at night because during the day those corpses are swarming with wasps. Back in the 70s, I was a crewman on a Navy ocean-going tug that was undergoing engine repairs in Guam. As we were unable to get underway to avoid an oncoming typhoon, we tripled up the lines and hunkered down on board. Near midnight, the eye passed directly over us. We ran out to check the lines and marveled at the creepy silence and clear sky where minutes before we were experiencing 100-knot winds and horizontal rain. A few minutes later, the other side of the wall hit, and we were back in it. Scariest? Stupid people. I was deployed on USS Abraham Lincoln, had been for 8 months, and was hanging out in the smoke pit to cope with the waste. When suddenly, someone turns to me and asks with a straight face, "Hey, are we in the Atlantic or the Pacific?" We were in the Indian Ocean. This guy had been a sailor for years. He was responsible for some pretty vital stuff to keep our birds from falling out of the sky. Think about that for a moment. Right now, some poor miserable person on the front lines is maintaining equipment vital to national security, and he might just be a complete idiot. When I was in the Navy, we got sent to the Persian Gulf. We transited the Atlantic, and needless to say, there was some weird aerial phenomena. This was back in 2015, and I was on the ship that made the news about it. I remember one night I was topside, and while I was smoking a cigarette, trying to decompress from the day, I looked out on the horizon and saw a set of about 4 to 6 lights, about a hand width above the horizon. They were following us. They would dip down and come closer and closer. The unnerving thing was that we weren't launching any of our alert birds or manning the guns, which means it didn't have a radar signature, and if it did, it was identified as friendly. The lights didn't move in a natural way at all, they defied physics and everything we know. We were on a glass-bottom boat tour in Hawaii once, in Hanauma Bay, and were headed to an area well known for humpback whales to gather, breed, and nurse. The tour operator said they weren't allowed to approach closer than 100 feet, but there were often large groups of whales in the area, so the chances of seeing a couple were very high. When the boat was in transit, there was a stream of agitated water under the hull, so you couldn't see anything. I thought the whole glass-bottom thing was a scam until we stopped moving, then the view was incredible. The water was a beautiful blue, and visibility seemed unlimited. We had stopped over top of a reef of sorts, and the diversity of sea life was amazing. The tour operator, who was a grizzled old islander tanned a dark shade of brown, was on the PA describing the amazing sights below our feet. He spoke with the laid-back, chilled-out voice you'd expect from a guy whose job was being on vacation in Hawaii. We hadn't seen any humpbacks up close, though, just a few breaches a long way off, when suddenly the view in the glass bottom was obscured by bubbles. A whale had swum, at high speed, right under the boat. Then another, and another, and another, a conveyor belt of whales. They started rubbing up against and bumping into the boat. I don't know how big or long the boat was, maybe 75 feet, held about 100 people, but the impacts were enough to make us slide around on the plastic benches. Everyone was looking down through the glass bottom, but I glanced up for a second, and we were surrounded, on all sides, by whales 8 or 10 deep. At first, the tour operator was gushing with excitement, saying this had never happened to him in 30 years, how lucky we were, how amazing it was. He said the whales were 45 to 60 feet long and could weigh 40 tons. They were so graceful for their size, all covered in barnacles. It was great fun, the whales seemed quite playful. Then the bumping intensified to the point where all the passengers were sliding on the plastic benches, crashing into one another, and a few fell onto the floor. People were screaming, and children were crying. Obvious fear started creeping into the tour operator's voice, and that fear percolated down to the tourists. Eventually, he stopped talking, and we all just resigned ourselves to our fate. You realize at that moment how small and helpless you are, and how big and wild Mother Nature is. It went on, for about 20 minutes, so long it wasn't even fun anymore. The whales seemed to be terrorizing us. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they disappeared. Literally 1 second we were engulfed in a maelstrom, and the next second we were alone on the ocean. The boat captain started the engines, and we headed back to the shore. Everyone sat in stunned silence. Husbands consoled wives, women comforted children, not even the tour operator spoke for the 30-minute journey back to shore. As we approached the dock, he came back on the PA with his sales pitch about recommending him to others, but his voice was still pretty shaky. I thought, it probably takes a lot to rattle that guy. We were probably in more danger than we knew. A few years back, I was in Kona doing some around town exploring when a friend asked if I wanted to go see manta rays. I took him up on the offer, and we headed down to the Marriott Hotel on the water. We walked around the side of the building and wandered on some rocks until we reached a certain point where he told me to jump in. All I had on was a scuba mask and some trunks, but it was enough so I could see where we were swimming and still be able to breathe. Being smaller and shorter than I, my friend took the lead, and I tried to follow. But as soon as I looked down into the clear nighttime water, my heart sank. I could see the bottom. Not just see it, but I could judge the depth. Now, I'm not hugely afraid of heights, but I have a small sense of acrophobia, like that sudden stomach drop you get when you're up really high and look down. That, except I was floating on top of it and didn't expect it to be that deep. I lost focus for a second and had to slow my breathing pattern before I could continue. We eventually made it to a small tourist boat where a group of people were gathered, watching 3 manta rays perform in the water below. God, those things are big, and being able to get a sense of how deep the water was didn't help that fact at all. Probably not the story you were expecting, but it still gives me shivers to this day. On a side note, I'm not generally afraid of the ocean, though there are some pretty crazy stories on this thread, but this experience definitely instilled the fear of God in me. Many years ago, a family friend took me out to sea for the first time. I had never been fishing or on a boat and always wanted to go. We went out into the Gulf of Mexico, according to him, about 3 or so miles out. We just planned to hang out on the boat for half the day and fish a little. Well, you know how when you're in a field or big open space, like the ocean, and a cloud above approaches, you can see its shadow on the ground/water? Well, I saw that. Maybe stretched a few hundred feet wide. I mentioned to my friend how cool it was that we could see an entire cloud's shadow coming at us out in the ocean. Then I looked up to see which cloud it was. There was none. It was a clear blue day. The only clouds I could see were on the horizon far off. That's strange. I suggested that maybe we were just moving toward a high area of land, just a few feet deep. He said no because we were anchored. Now both of our hearts dropped. It was approaching us fast. We were laughing hysterically out of pure amazement and confusion. Now it was maybe 30 feet away. We were just on the right side of it. As soon as the shadow began to pass under us, the boat got yanked hard. I fell on my back, and my friend was holding onto a rail and didn't fall. The boat settled, and the shadow continued to move past. It eventually turned to the right and went out to sea. My friend and I were freaking out and decided to just leave. He went to pull the anchor up, but there was no anchor. Just the part where the anchor was attached, and it was ripped off. Damaged. Whatever that thing was clipped the chain and ripped it off without slowing down at all. That's why the boat yanked. Again, it was huge. If I had to compare it to something, I would say maybe a tad bigger than a football field. As for shape, it was eggyish. It was oval. So the front end was sort of rounded but more pointed than the back. Imagine the shadow of a giant egg with the top facing you. We still have no leads on what kind of animal is that big and can just bump into an anchor and rip it off like it was made of butter. In the Bay of Biscay, at least 50 nautical miles from land and not on any main coastal routes, I found a derelict, very expensive RHIB with 4 250 horsepower outboards on it. The RHIB had hit something, as one of the sponsons was deflated, but it was fully afloat. I was part of a boarding team, so I got on board. There was no one on it, but there were food supplies, 3 backpacks with stuff in them, and a working VHF radio. The kill cord was out. No maydays or even pan-pans had been issued in that area recently. We couldn't salvage it, just reported it and continued on. Why those 3 guys, at least, were out there, smuggling for sure, but what and for whom, what caused their accident, what decisions they made, and what happened to them, and mostly, what happened to the families who have people missing really stuck with me. I felt so close to the last moments of people, but in reality, I could do very little. Weird feeling. Bonus story. I saw a huge green meteor that split into 3 pieces and smashed into the sea on an early morning watch in the Indian Ocean, hundreds of miles from land. One of the most awesome things I have ever seen, but the feeling that me and my watch keepers could have been the only people to see it, and certainly the only ones to see the impact, was a sobering thought about what amazing things happen on this planet that we all just miss. I was stationed in Cuba for a bit. 2 tales come to mind. Not creepy but definitely awe-inspiring. I was snorkeling in the reefs, looking for conch shells and sand dollars. On one of my ways down, I noticed a large school of fish swimming towards me. I panicked, thinking they were being chased by something bigger. They ended up surrounding me and kind of swimming around me like a tornado for a bit before disappearing. Nothing was chasing them. It was really cool seeing all of those fish around me. Second event, when jellyfish are young, they don't have tentacles or anything and look like clear globs of jelly during the day. At night, they give off a fluorescent glow when they move or are touched. So one night, I'm in my patrol boat with my partner, and we were running dark, looking for overfishers. There is zero light pollution, so stars and the moon illuminate everything. I saw more shooting stars in my time there than most see in 2 lifetimes. I look over the side, and there is a whole school of these young jellyfish on the surface, just moving with the waves, all glowing in the moonlight with each passing wave. There were dozens of them, and it was just so amazing to see. Recreational sailor. Went on a 3-week open water trip with a bunch of complete strangers when we were all about 17. One night, there was a bad storm, but I was captaining, and we were fine. It was probably around 2 a.m. when one of the girls in the crew saw an SOS signal not far away, so we went to check it out. It was one man on a tiny old power boat that's basically meant to island hop around the British Virgin Islands or places like that. Every piece of equipment had been destroyed in the storm, and this man had zero control. Of course, we brought him on board and took him where he needed to go, which was hours in the opposite direction that his boat was headed. This has a happy ending, but if my crew hadn't seen the smallest signal light that was half covered by waves, that man wouldn't have survived to see the sun again. It isn't all that weird, I guess. When I was in the Navy, we ran into the 2nd largest pod of dolphins in the world. This was in the Western Pacific. Anyway, they were a fun-loving bunch and, like many mammals, followed us because we dumped food over the side while underway. As we sailed, the dolphins formed a line on our port side and would take turns diving under the prow. Then the line would make its way aft along the starboard side and repeat. They did this for a couple of hours before breaking off and going wherever they go. Sort of like a conga line. A few of us were temporarily assigned to the USNS Tulagi, I'm not sure if that was the name, for 10 days, where we saw the most amazing school of flying fish. They would swim alongside, and dozens at a time would come out of the water and fly along. It was one of the most spectacular natural things I've ever witnessed. I wish I had known the history of that ship when I was on her. The Tulagi was from World War II and had survived being hit by the kamikazes. Typhoons were the scariest part. We had to sail through 2 during monsoon season. It was a good-sized ship, 300 feet long with 15 feet of freeboard and 4 decks above the weather deck. They tied off lines on the main deck so the engineering section could get their soundings from the ports in the deck. This told them how much water was in the bilges and the holes. These were maybe 3-inch holes with a cap, and a weighted line was dropped. The boys had to clip onto the line for safety as the swells were 30 to 40 feet. You could get your face washed standing on the flying bridge. That's 50 feet above the sea. We would rise on the wave peaks and you could see the world. Then we would fall into the troughs and all you could see was the ocean above you, way above. We sat literally in a bowl of water, and that is all you could see. It was pretty much agreed upon the realization of how puny and powerless we truly are in the face of nature. I'm not a sailor, but I was swimming off the coast of Kauai. I would say that I was snorkeling, but I kept having trouble with my pipe, so I just had a pair of goggles on. Anyway, a fish bit me. There were a ton of really pretty fish around, and I was feeding them bread. Don't worry, it was legal where I was. It's really crazy how quickly they'll swarm you for bread. One poor fish mistook the inside of my thumb for a breadcrumb and bit me. I never thought that fish could bite as hard as that one did. It's like being bit by a bird. It was enough to draw blood, so I swam back to shore and held a paper towel to the wound. Never underestimate the biting power of a fish. My brother was a submariner in the Royal Navy for years. He told me the scariest thing he'd ever come across was an incompetent captain. Apparently, when the submarine is in trouble, one of the options is for the captain to order an immediate surface. The boat will basically shoot up like a rocket. Prior to doing this, the order goes around for the crew to brace. When that order goes around, every man on the boat stops what they're doing and hangs on to something for dear life, knowing that the boat is about to shoot upwards at breakneck speed. The captain ordered brace, and then did nothing. The boat did not shoot upwards, it sat exactly where it was. The crew, knowing what should be happening, started to wonder why they were not rocketing towards the surface. The only explanation, forgive my lack of technical knowledge, is that the submarine is in serious trouble and will never see the surface again. A whole submarine crew, including my brother, started to ponder their imminent deaths. Eventually, the captain alerted the crew that they were not in danger, but enough time had elapsed for the crew to get seriously worried. The second officer refused to serve with him again. Not really creepy per se. I was on a fishing boat out of Destin, Florida. We were leaving the dock, heading out to the Gulf just before dawn. I kept seeing these orange blobs in the wake. The further we went, the more we saw. They were everywhere. Then we started seeing sea turtles. A lot of sea turtles. They were swimming and eating these orange blobs. After asking the captain what was going on, I found out the orange blobs were jellyfish. And it was some kind of migration, mating thing. The sea turtles followed them towards shore to feast on them. It was amazing to witness. When I say they were everywhere, I mean everywhere. Every 5 feet in every direction, there were sea turtles chasing jellyfish. I have a video somewhere, but this was 30 years ago. Not quite as mesmerizing as prior stories, but it was the first time I'd ever seen this. Atikokan, Ontario. I don't remember the name of the lake. It was flooded on purpose, not sure why, maybe to create a lake. Maybe to dam power. Doesn't matter, I was fishing with a guide. The air was still. The water was crystal clear. I looked down, and we were literally floating over an entire forest, at the top of the pine trees. All you could see were thousands of 75-foot pine tree trunks standing side by side as they were when they were alive before the water flooded that valley. You could not see the bottom. One of my co-workers fled to the United States from Vietnam in a small boat as a young child. She was one of the boat people. We were complaining about little things when she explained why she almost never got upset. She was only 7 when this happened. She and her sister, father, mother, and grandfather were in a small fishing boat in the middle of the ocean. They had been out of food for several days. She and her sister, 5, managed to catch an albatross on the boat. Her father said it was bad luck to kill one and released it. She said as she watched it fly away, she knew then that she and her family were going to starve to death. She hated her father at that point too. The next day they were picked up by a trawler and taken to California. She still wears an albatross necklace for good luck. I am in the Navy, and I was troubleshooting something one night in the dark passageways around the ship. After night falls, all of the white lights get switched over to red lights so people can sleep if they are not at work. So as I was going around the corner, a mysterious figure was just standing there in the dark red lights. I screamed and took a defensive stance against it. When I shined my light on it, I saw it was just a spine board, the ones you use for transporting patients that have big foam things for the head and neck. So I continued troubleshooting, and after a while, I came back around this corner and I screamed again, heart stopping, same spine board. It just scared me again. This happened about 5 times. I knew it was there, but I couldn't do anything against its power to scare the life out of me. Now I'd like to hear my shipmates' stories about the night they heard screaming and all they found was me, with no explanation. I was an engineer and first mate on a converted LCM-8 in the fish trade. We operated in the Gulf of Alaska, Prince William Sound, and Bristol Bay fisheries as a tender, taking salmon and herring from smaller boats and villages in for processing on land. We had a regular spool windlass on the back, and for some reason, the company thought this made us equipped to tow a 220-foot barge from Whittier, up through the Aleutian Islands at False Pass, and around to Bristol Bay and back each year. The Gulf of Alaska can be a cruel place sometimes, and at 4 knots max speed, we got caught in a doozy. We tried sheltering behind an island, can't remember, we were working our way up the Aleutian Peninsula, but even so, we were unable to hold against the wind and got pulled out. The little windlass on the back deck was getting pulled off and ripping a hole in the engine room in the process. Eventually, in 25-foot seas, we let go of the barge and just tracked it and followed it on radar, figuring we'd recover it when things calmed down in a few days. In the horrific days that followed, during which I must have vomited twice my body weight, we nearly got rolled once and took on about 10,000 gallons of water in one of our compartments. So, good times. On the last really bad night, I was on watch in the wheelhouse while the captain slept. About 3 a.m., and we were rolling 33 to 37 degrees, losing 2 knots against the gale by the Lauren. Yes, it was a while ago, with the barge popping in and out on radar about 4 miles in our lee. Suddenly, the whole ship reverberated and shook with a thunderous boom, and I was sure we were done. We'd obviously hit something hard. I woke the captain and the deckhand, our entire crew, 15 minutes later. Still no sign of flooding in any compartments or other alarms, but I noticed the Lauren lost signal, and I wasn't having any luck on the SSB trying to call in for a possible rescue. The deck lights wouldn't come on, and we had a couple of popped breakers in the NAV lights. After a while, it became obvious we weren't sinking, so we went about our watches just keeping an eye on things. At first light, I roped off and went on deck to see what had happened. The LCM-8 had a deck house at bulwark level, and a pilot house and stateroom built above that. So the roof of the pilot house was a good 25 feet above the water. Mounted to the steel of the pilot house was a 4-inch steel pipe that went up a few feet to a 3-inch steel crossmember, forming a large T on which our radio and navigation antennas, as well as our mast lights, were mounted. It was gone. The whole thing. Bent over at 90 degrees and broken off as if by the hand of God himself. Also gone were the life rafts, which were also mounted on the roof structure. The massive 4-inch steel mast had been bent over and torn off. It wasn't like it was corroded and just broke. There was obviously massive force involved, and even the reinforced steel plate of the mast step on the cabin roof was distorted. It took us about a week, but eventually, the seas abated and we were able to bring the barge in under tow to the shelter of the peninsula once again. We made the next 1,000 miles without much except flat seas and beautiful vistas. Such is the life of the mariner. When we eventually got into Dillingham, everyone was quite surprised as we had been declared lost at sea, and the Coast Guard had already given up the search days before. Both our life rafts had been found empty with their APIRBs deployed, and we were all assumed dead. I still have no idea what monstrous thing must have reached out of the sea and broken off that mast, but whatever it was inches away from taking out the wheelhouse where I was blindly staring out into the rain-tortured darkness on that night. Shit still haunts me. I worked the shrimp boats in the Gulf back in the 70s. 100 miles off the coast of Louisiana, the sea got dead calm. I mean dead calm, not a ripple or a swell. The sea was so calm that vibrations from the engine idling would make little ripples in the water. The surface of the sea looked like a huge, never-ending mirror extending out in all directions. The visual memory I have of seeing that perfectly flat sea in the moonlight is deeply etched in my memory, and I can see it today in my mind just as real as if it were happening now. I could talk about 25-foot seas in the middle of a hurricane, or a half-dozen waterspouts dancing around us during a summer squall, or sargassum seaweed as far as the eye could see, so thick around the boat that you could walk on it, or flying fish all taking flight at the same time like a flock of birds skimming across the water. But none of that stuff had the impact on me like the dead calm of the sea 100 miles offshore. I was sailing north off the Pacific side of Mexico this summer. We were the only ship around when my watchman noticed a target on the radar that, when acquired, was found to have a very closest point of approach, CPA. Neither of us could see any other navigation lights beyond our own, so I had him turn on the searchlights to see if it was a small boat or what and to show that our own ship was there and to give us some room. We couldn't see anyone, but the target made a broad alteration to increase the CPA a touch more. As the target was coming down the starboard side, I turned off the searchlights and went on the bridge deck to try and see or even hear any engines, but nothing. I don't know if it was just scanty radar information or what, but it definitely creeped me out. I worked on tugboats for about 6 years. The back deck is considered a wet deck, meaning it isn't unusual for it to be underwater at times. We were making tow with an oil rig at sea with waves that were 14 to 16 feet, and one hit us just right, taking my coworker George and pulling him out to sea. Now it's 3 a.m. and pitch black. This is nearly always a death sentence. About 20 seconds later, which felt like an eternity, another wave brought George back on deck, plopping him safely on his ass right next to the winch. George laughed and got right back to work without missing a beat. On deployment in the Persian Gulf, I was part of the visit, board, search, and seizure, VBSS, team on my ship. We basically boarded small craft and looked for drugs and weapons being transported from Iran to other nations in that area. More often than not, we would be called away to board a vessel, and when you're on a smaller craft for boarding as opposed to a large warship, you are able to notice the things floating around in the water. The thing that I learned quickly about the Persian Gulf is that there are a lot of dead bodies floating around in it. When you think about why there are bodies in there, it makes sense though. It's a relatively smaller body of water, almost entirely landlocked by a region constantly in turmoil. From what was explained to me, it's mostly Iran and its coastal navy just bushwhacking people out there that they think are aiding the enemy, but they end up usually being poor fishermen trying to provide for their families. Dad and grandparents all lived on a boat. We are from the southern part of China. So when I say boat, I mean those huge ones from back in the days, like pirate ships big. A family of 18 lived on this boat. They would fish back and forth from China to Vietnam. Anyways, Dad said sirens, also known as people in the water singing to lure you in, are real. He said he and others have seen or heard them. It's how my eldest aunt drowned, according to him. My other aunts also said that's how she drowned, but never actually gave out a story. They all knew each other's voices, and if they heard singing that didn't sound like any of them, they knew to cover their ears and head back down below. Thus, the banging on the pots and pans to scare them away. They even went to get fireworks to scare them away. Sometimes they would have a high-pitched scream. They tried everything to get rid of it. They even thought throwing fish back into the water would be an offering, but that didn't work. When my aunt drowned, my grandfather became a more abusive alcoholic. My dad said many times he thought of pushing his dad over and just blaming it on the sirens, but was too scared of what my grandpa would do if he survived the fall into the water. I've asked about this story so many times, but it never ever changes. When stories don't change, you know there's truth. And when everyone else's account of the same story is also the same, then you know it's the truth. They all said they heard or saw it. Just a person in the water when there shouldn't be anyone else. They didn't look like they were in distress. More so that they were just taking a nice relaxing swim and that you should be in there with them. They made the water seem so enticing. Yup, that was my dad's story, my grandma's story, my mom's story, and even my grandpa's story. They all said the same thing. When I was about 19, maybe 20, my mom's boyfriend at the time decided to take us out on his boat one afternoon so that we could lounge around and swim in the ocean far from the shore. We were super excited because the water was turquoise, completely see-through, and the perfect temperature that day. So we found what seemed to be the perfect location, dropped the anchor, and had a snack. Before long, we were completely surrounded by hundreds of giant milky white jellyfish. There were so many that we couldn't see clear water anywhere around us. Their bells were easily 5 feet in diameter, if not more. We did not swim that day. A couple of years ago, I was sailing as a cadet on a merchant vessel, and I was scheduled on the evening watch. The rest of the crew was enjoying dinner, and I was to call if anything went wrong. We were sailing over open ocean, no land within a day's sailing around us, and all of a sudden, I noticed an island coming up on my bow. It was still far away, but it shouldn't be there. I looked at the maps, checked my position multiple times, and then I noticed the island did not appear on my radars. I called down to the mess room to tell them there was a weird island in front of us. The chief mate came up and checked the maps and positions again. He also noticed that the radars did not see the island. We called the captain, and when he came up, he started laughing. He was an old sailor with over 40 years of experience under his belt. He explained to us it was a Fata Morgana. The real island was more than a day's sailing away in the direction we were heading at that moment. After that incident, he took over the watch, and I went down. It wasn't really creepy, but it was strange. 2 years ago, I was about 150 miles offshore from Long Island, in a 31-foot boat. We were trolling for yellowfin tuna. In the distance, we saw 2 huge fins coming out of the water, so we headed towards them, thinking it was a couple of sharks. As we got closer, we realized it was one big shark. There it was, just cruising slowly at the surface, not even the slightest bit disturbed by us approaching. Once we got up next to it, we realized that this shark was almost as big as the boat. It had to be at least 25 feet long and several thousand pounds. I was in absolute shock as we passed it. I'd never seen a shark even close to that big. I've seen plenty of whales, turtles, dolphins, sharks, all kinds of crazy things out at sea, but never a predator this large. It was definitely not a whale shark. This thing was a killer. I want to say that it was a tiger shark, but the internet says they don't even get close to that big, so I really just don't know. I wish I could have gotten a picture of it, but I was just frozen, I couldn't even move. I will never forget that moment. The ocean is an incredible place.